Mr. Jones worked as a mechanic, the following items were found. There was the track phone packaging I told you about, the red gasoline can that I told you about. There were some other unusual items found. There was a black bra found in his toolbox. There were a number of odd items in there as well, but one of those things was a listing on a sheet of paper of bra sizes, phone numbers, and some sexual activity references, which would lead investigators back to a number of escorts in town. And you'll hear evidence from those escorts that the defendant would frequent those escorts, that he knew the escort business. That's why he knew Paige Bergfeld. And in a locked cabinet in that same workplace, a Pampered Chef food scale of the type sold by Paige Bergfeld was there. She sold Pampered Chef. That was one of her businesses, and I'll talk about that too. You'll also hear evidence, ladies and gentlemen, of prior incidents of efforts to control women by resorting to violence. The first one involved his ex-wife, Lisa Nance. The defendant had become suspicious that she might be cheating on him. They were separated at the time. She and a friend were watching movies that night, and when Lisa tried to take her friend Joe Bear home, the defendant followed them in a vehicle. He threatened him with a gun. He ran him off the road. He took a couple of shots at Joe Bear as Joe Bear ran in the opposite direction, narrowly missing killing him and actually drawing blood and leaving a bullet hole in his ball cap. He told Lisa, he forced Lisa Nance, his wife, now ex-wife, into the car, told her he was going to shoot her, but she eventually got him calmed down enough that they went to a location she was able to call police and get away from him. It wasn't very long after that a second incident occurred. She talked him into leaving the house with her to go and wanted to get into a little bit more public location. He made her take her car, and he says, "Don't worry about it." Instead of driving, his face was sweating. She started to cry. She was concerned about what was happening. She asked him if they were going to go eat, and he said no. She asked him what he was going to do as he drove into a more remote location, and he told her that he was going to kill her. She started crying more, and he started hitting her as they drove down the road. He told her he was going to kill her and put her in a lake in a remote location where she would not be found. She eventually talked him into pulling over. She said, I'll try to convince you that I still love you. She said that she wanted to have sex with him. They started to do so in the car. It got uncomfortable, and she said, let's go to a hotel. He allowed her to drive to a hotel in town, and when he got out to get a hotel room, she took off with the car. She sped off and got stopped by law enforcement and got away from him. The evidence in this case will also prove that the defendant thwarted efforts to obtain evidence against him by systematically destroying the evidence that could link him to the murder in this case. He burned the car that he and Paige Bergfeld had been in, and he buried Paige in that location I talked about where she couldn't be found for so long that there was no way to gather evidence from her remains. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence in this case. First of all, let's talk about the victim. This is Paige Bergfeld. As you can see, Paige was born on April 27th of 1973. She lived at 2512 Oleaster Court, and she had a couple of different businesses that she operated. One of those was Pampered Chef. She sold Pampered Chef products, and some of you may be familiar with that, but those are cooking products. She also had a business called Brain Dance, where she would teach little kids how to dance. She would teach them dance in a way to kind of help them along. And she also operated a company called Models Inc. And it's that company that would put her into contact with the defendant, Lester Jones. When she operated the Models Inc. Business, she went by the name of Carrie. And she had a business location, at least an office location, that was located at 2754 Compass Drive, number 301C. And you'll see that listed there two of the cell phones. One was her personal cell, one was her Models Inc. phone number. Those numbers become important because law enforcement gathered information from those as they began this investigation. And they gathered that information early on in this case. Is an ex-husband to Paige Bergfeld. They were married for a couple of years, and they lived in the Denver area for a while. You see his phone number there. And he was aware of Paige's business, Models Inc. He wasn't necessarily opposed to the business. He wasn't all that excited about the fact that she owned the business and took risks. But nonetheless, he was aware of the business. He and Paige had begun to rekindle their relationship in 2007. And it was on the day that she disappeared that he would have contact with her. Rob Dixon is another person you might hear from in this case, but Rob Dixon was an ex-husband to Paige. Again, they were married from 1998, shortly after she'd been married to Mr. Bigler, to about 2005. Mr. Dixon lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's a paramedic out there, and he and Paige had 3 children. All 3 children lived with Paige here in Grand Junction: Jess, Taft, and Cole. This is Mr. Jones. You've already met Mr. Jones. He's sitting over here at the defense table. Mr. Jones lived here in Grand Junction at 3072 Hill Avenue. He worked at Bob Scott's RV. He was originally from Delta County, which becomes important in terms of where her remains were found. He worked for 8 to 10 years at the Hotchkiss Fire Department, which is also interesting in light of the fact that her car was found burned on July 1st. In fact, it was found burning on July 1st, 2007. And that's at least one of his phone numbers. On June 28th, she disappeared. Her kids were at home, and they had expected that she would come home on the evening of June 28th. The kids had a caretaker named Nubia Martinez, and you'll hear a stipulation with respect to the facts that she would tell you about. Nubia was their caretaker. She lived in the home. She had a room in the home, and they expected her to come home that evening, and she never did. She never stayed out all night, Nubia would tell you, and she will tell you that when she left in the morning, Nubia Martinez didn't know exactly where she was going, but that she said she would return. Paige never came home that night. Jess, her older daughter, left voicemails for her mother that evening and the next day. And you'll get to hear some of those voicemails and the anguish that's involved in those voicemails as Jess is looking for her mother, who by then has disappeared. Howard Biegler will tell you that he last saw Paige on June 28th, 2007, up in Eagle. That's where they had met. They had had a romantic encounter up there. As I indicated, they were rekindling their relationship. And he said that for Howard Biegler, Paige Bergfeld, George Coraluzzo, who was somebody who was trying to contact her as well, Rob Dixon, who she had regular contact with. They obtained the phone records for a John Livingston, or a message from a John Livingston left from a call at the Motel 6, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They had a Tim Zotto. They had a Joe Carruth. They had Lester Jones' personal cell. And they had track phone records that, at least at that moment, they didn't know what to do with. So here's where we have the calls prior to June 28th, 2007, instigated by a number of people. There are 3 calls. 2 were from Mr. Jones, the defendant's personal cell phone prior to June 25th. When you hear about the phone records and how they were obtained, you'll see they only went back a certain way. So it's not like they went back a year. They went back a month or so when they obtained the cell phone records. There were 7 calls. 2 were from his personal cell from June 25th to June 27th of 2007. There were 3 calls from a track phone on June 27th. There were 8 calls. Call from Mr. Heald on June 26th, and you'll find out that Mr. Heald, in fact, met and had lunch with her that week. There were routine calls daily to and from Mr. Dixon and Mr. Biegler and Ms. Bergfeld. And there were 5 calls that were to or from Mr. Coraluzzo on June 27th, and you'll see that that changes a little bit on the 28th. On Thursday, June 28th, 2007, the day that Paige Bergfeld goes missing. Early in the morning that day, she calls Howard Biegler, and they have a conversation. At that point, she is here in Grand Junction, and he is over in Aurora, which is where he lives. There are also 6 early morning phone calls, all to voicemail, from a guy named George Coraluzzo. At 7:49, George Coraluzzo again calls Paige, goes to her voicemail, and again, she's having this conversation with Howard Biegler. And I'll kind of move through these a little bit fast, but at 9 in the morning, he calls her. She's in Grand Junction, he's in Aurora. At 9:57, she calls him, again, still in the same locations. And at 10:30, they're still in roughly the same locations. And we can track these by the cell phone usage and by what cell phone towers they're hitting off of. At 10:30, again, they have a call back and forth, and again, they're in roughly the same place. At 10:26, 10:27, and then we begin to see that his cell phone tower changes a little bit, as does hers, as we go on later in the morning. At 10:43, now her tower location is at a tower over by the Clifton area as she travels down I-70 to go meet with Howard Biegler in Eagle. And his changes from one cell phone tower to another in Aurora. At 11:05, he calls her. It goes to voicemail. At 11:08, there's a call, and at that point, her tower location is again at Palisade, which indicates that she's traveling further east on I-70, and his tower location is now changed to Wheat Ridge. And that's how we can track what her movements are that day. She calls, at 11:24, she calls a man named Joe Carruth. And what you'll hear as the evidence in this case is Joe is a person that she had prior knowledge of. She knew Mr. Carruth, and what she wanted to have Mr. Carruth do was dance for her. She had promised somebody that she could put together a male dancer for a bachelorette party, and she was trying to get Mr. Carruth to do that for her. So you'll see that there are some calls back and forth to Mr. Carruth. At 11:26, Mr. Coraluzzo is calling Paige. This time he's using a different phone to call Paige, and you'll hear no evidence to indicate that Mr. Coraluzzo and Ms. Bergfeld ever actually connect up. There's no evidence to show that the two of them ever actually talked that day. At 11:28, Mr. Carruth calls Paige back, and again, now her tower location is a Parachute, so now she's moving down I-70. I'm sorry if this kind of drags on a little bit through here, but this is important because we can show where she was at most of the times, at least during the day of June 28th. 12:31, her home phone calls her cell phone. That one goes to voicemail. The kids or Ms. Martinez trying to get a hold of her. At 12:45, Paige calls Mr. Beegler, again, continuing to try and get a hold of him, and by now, she's in Eagle. At 12:46, Mr. Caruth calls her back, and that call goes to voicemail, and she calls him another couple of times, again, because she's trying to get Mr. Caruth to do something for her. She has an interest in actually talking with Mr. Caruth because she's trying to get him to dance for her. She calls him again at 12:53. Her cell phone tower is in Eagle. He calls her back at 12:55. And Mr. Caruth will tell you that when he finally called her back, he told her, no, I don't want to do this. I've decided I really don't want to do this for you. At 13:06, 106, she calls Mr. Beegler, and she's in Eagle, and Mr. Beegler's tower location is not listed at that point. But as you can see from these tower locations, these phone calls that we track her with go from the in-town and did in this case is they had to kind of narrow down the list of suspects to look at, and so they used the cell phone records to do that. Mr. Coraluzzo was one of the people that was certainly trying to get a hold of her. There's no indication that he ever did. At 16:45, at 4:54, her home phone calls her again, and that goes to voicemail. At 4:55, again, Coraluzzo is trying to get a hold of her. Again, that goes to voicemail. At 5:22 in the afternoon, Mr. Dixon calls Paige, Rob Dixon. Again, it goes to voicemail, and at that point, his tower location is where he lives, in Chester, Pennsylvania. And we also get other records. We indicated that we got Mr. Jones's records. Mr. Jones's sister calls Mr. Jones during the course of that, and Mr. Jones's cell phone location is coming off of a tower at the South Camp area. At 18:38, at 6:38 in the evening, the Motel 6 calls Paige. That's to voicemail. You'll find out later that Motel 6 equals John Livingston. John Livingston is trying to get Palisade. She's almost all the way home again. And Mr. Beegler's tower location, again, is not listed. he's presumably headed back to Denver, and he'll tell you that that's where he was headed, that he was headed back home. At 20:36, she calls to check her voicemail, and she's at Clifton, again, moving this way. 20:37, she calls Mr. Beegler, and now she's at 688.5, 29.5 road. Again, his tower location is not listed. At 20:45, though, she calls him again. Now, her tower location she's bouncing off a cell phone tower that's right here. That's important because there are other things that are right in that area. Right in that area is, in this little inset here, is Walker Products. That's where her car would be found burning. That's where the car fire occurred. And this is Bob Scott RV, less than a block away from where the car is found burning. There's also some interesting information that comes from this area, because that evening there's a traffic accident that occurs here on June 28th at about 6:36. That traffic is detoured for some time during that evening. And so she is having difficulty, when she calls from here, she's having difficulty getting over into this area, because there's an intersection here where the intersection of 23 Road and G Road, and that's where the accident occurred. These are the phone calls that she made as she moved down I-70, and this is the last one she made here. Later on in the evening, we've got some other pings from George Coraluzzo down in this area. Lester Jones track phone pings off of this area at 6:40 in the evening on June 28th. Again, remember that Mr. Jones, when he talks to law enforcement, will tell them that he never called her, and that he actually never even bought a track phone. Like I said, phone information is important in this case. We know that Rob Dixon had daily phone contact with Paige. They had 3 children together, so he had contact with her daily. Mr. Coraluzzo began calling her only on June 27th into June 28th. And on some of these dates, as you can see, on Monday, June 25th, when I talked about Mr. Jones and Paige Bergfeld hitting off the same tower and driving around in the same area, on June 25th, June 26th, June 27th, Mr. Jones actually used his personal cell to try and call Paige, was able to set up the appointment with Carolyn Linderholm for June 27th. And again, Stephen Heald, who you'll hear from as well, calls Paige on June 26th, 2007, and I believe that he'll tell you that they had lunch that day. Lisa Norcross, who works for the Sheriff's Department, was one of the investigators. She verified the location of her last call. That you can see that the green, the green dot right there is the cell phone tower location. That's important because we see in a minute that some other people also saw her car. So during the timeline of her disappearance, so that we can establish when she disappears, folks, there's evidence to indicate that Mr. Solis, it was a guy that was going to work down in that area, that he saw a red car between 9:45 and 10:10, and it looked to him like there was a woman in the car. It looked to him like it was perhaps somebody's wife going to pick them up or something. But he remembers seeing the red car in the location of Walker SMS. There's a street there called Logos, and in that same location, right around the area where the defendant works, is where he saw the red car. Excuse me. Patrick Hupke will tell you that he was diverted by the accident, so we have confirmation both from he and from Doug Norcross, who was a police officer who had verified the area of that accident that night, that he was diverted by the accident, that it was hard to get around in that area at that time because the accident was right there at 23 Road and G Road. David Laux, if I could back this up just a minute, David Laux will tell you that he saw a red car, very similar to Peyton Bergfeld's, down in this area right here. There's a trade center called, I think, day, and she sees it again at about that same time on the next day, June 30th. So we start to get an idea of this car that had disappeared for a bit and is now back and parked at Walker SMS. There's several more sightings of the car over the next couple of days. Dennis Harling, some of the last sightings are Dennis Harling sees the car there undamaged at, I believe, about 5 p.m. on Sunday, July 1st. Leanne Kleintobe sees the car parked at Walker SMS about 9:15 p.m. on July 1st, 2007. Undamaged at that point. And between 9:15 and 9, Page disappeared. She gave them information regarding her place of employment, her home address. She knew where she had gone and, in fact, was able to tell investigators, here's where Jim lives, and they determined that, in fact, that was the defendant's home. So she took this meeting with the defendant, and when the defendant showed up when she showed up, the defendant asked her for sex right away. She said, "No, I'm not going to do that," but she does end up doing a topless massage, and they talk. denies any involvement in her disappearance. And when he's questioned about his activities on July 1st, the day that he leaves his home to go down and set the fire, he says, we didn't do anything, meaning he and his wife. She had gotten back into town by then, and he said, we didn't do anything. He initially denies leaving the residence when he's at home with his wife. Then, when he's confronted, he acknowledges leaving, and then remembers that, oh yeah, I think I went down to turn off the lights at the business. While they're interviewing him on July 5th, his wife was contacted, and she had confirmed that she had been gone all week. She said that she attended church on July 1st, and that when she went to church, she went there by herself. He had gone supposedly to work, but you will see computer information that would say that he didn't go to work, but in fact got on the internet again on July 1st, 2007. She and her husband, Mr. Jones, met after church. They spent the rest of the day running errands, is what she would say. She said that on July 1st, 2007, at about 9 p.m., Lester Jones left the residence, claiming that he had to go turn the lights on, that he left the lights on at Bob Scott RV and he needed to go turn them off, which seemed unusual to her. She told investigators at that point that at about 10:10 or so, she reported that Mr. Jones had come back, had returned to the house and remained there until Monday morning. And during that period of time that he was gone, at 9:50, this is Paige Bergfeld's burned out car. Pictures taken the next day, July 2nd, or the morning, I believe, of July 2nd, 2007, showing that the entire interior of her car had been burned out and that the flames had licked out of the windows onto the sides of the car. And again, another perspective about where the vehicle was in relation to where his workplace was. And another map that shows kind of the location of Bob Scott RV, shows the location of Walker SMS, and it shows the location of Mr. Jones's house. Investigators would later go and determine how far it was between Mr. Jones's house and Bob Scott RV's, and would determine that it was about 9.1 miles. They took 3 different routes, you'll hear about those, and that they determined that it took about 20 minutes or so to go from his house at Hill Avenue up to his work at Bob Scott RV. There were search warrants that were obtained for his residence, for the truck, for Bob Scott's RVs, and during the search of Bob Scott's RV, there are a number of things that were found. The packaging for the track phone cell phone was discovered in a large box of trash right next to his workspace. There was a gas can, a red gas can located underneath his workspace. There were bras, wigs, a Pampered Chef scale, and some HornyMatch.com paperwork found in the same area. This is his workspace, and this is the trash can in which the track phone packaging was found. You can see underneath the table there's the red gas can that was located there as well. This is Mr. Jones's house at Hill Avenue. And these are the track phone records, or some of the information we got from the track phone. Again, there were calls on the track phone on June 27th and June 28th to Paige Bergfeld, and only to Models Inc., to her number. The packaging was found in that search. The phone number is tracked back to Walmart on North Avenue. In fact, the packaging had some numbers that enabled them to track that phone back to the Walmart. They found a video and recovered a video of those things. They get the track phone surveillance video on July 11th. That's after they've talked to Mr. Jones the first time they talked to him, and they determined that it was purchased on June 26th. Defendant, Mr. Jones. And during that second interview, he denies buying the track phone or knowing why the packaging could be in his trash. Denies it over and over again. He's even shown the video, and he says, well, yeah, that looks like me, but then continues to deny that he was the person buying the track phone. He does admit to going to the shop, but denies ever seeing the fire. At Bob Scott RV, during the course of the search, there's a locked cabinet that's locked up by his workplace. He's got hundreds of thousands of dollars and tools that are in his workplace, but he's got one little locked cabinet there without a key, and they eventually get it open. They find a Pampered Chef food scale. There's no evidence that his wife ever purchased one. They weren't available at that time. You'll hear that from Laura Ayers, who's one of the Pampered Chef people that had some contact with the business back then. And Laura Ayers will tell you that Paige had some old stock, and she certainly could have had one of those Pampered Chef scales. There was also a note found in the search of his workplace. On July 18th, 2007, there's a second search warrant that's done. They go to his house. They seize a couple of computers. Those computers are searched by a man named Mike Pachota, and you'll hear from Mike. Mike does a lot of acquiring computer information from computers. He's an expert in that area, and he'll tell you about the search that he performed on Mr. Jones' computers. And with respect to the Toshiba laptop computer that he had, he will tell you, Mike Pachota will tell you what all of these things indicate. But what it indicates primarily is that there was a lot of activity, and you'll see other information about this, but the activity on the internet, on pornography, and on hornymatches.com spikes during the week of July 25th through the time at least up to the point where his wife gets back on June 30th. There's a lot of activity in the mornings, and you'll see more evidence about this. And there's a lot of activity in the evenings, but there's those gaps I talked about. On Monday, there's the gap right at the time when he is going over, scoping out the situation, where he's driving his car, or what looks like a car identical to his, and there's an identical car to Paige Bergfeld's in that same area. They're both hitting off the same tower locations. There's a video that shows you what happens at that location. On Tuesday, there's a gap. I know you can't see that very well, but there's a gap right there on Tuesday. It's a little bit bigger gap. That's the gap that we know of where he's gone from the house. He's gone south and is hitting off of, when he gets a call from his wife, he's hitting off of a tower location down by Wells Gulch, down close to Delta County, or down close to the Delta County line there. Wednesday, there's that gap. Again, you can't see that very well, but there's a gap right there. That's the gap in computer activity that I talked about earlier, which is the gap where the defendant is actually meeting with Carol Linderholm and getting services from Carol, services that he wasn't happy with. And this big gap here, where there's no activity, is June 28th, 2007. That's the date that Paige Bergfeld disappears. And as you can see, after that evening, he gets back on the computer, and he's back on the computer accessing those same types of things. He's on there heavily on Saturday, and then his wife comes home Saturday afternoon, and from that point on, it diminishes slightly. On July 19th, 2000. her feet came up several inches shy of being able to reach the pedals if she was sitting in the driver's seat as it was set on July 1st after the fire, indicating that a much larger person had driven the car. They also start putting together some other information during the course of this investigation. And this all starts early on. When we talk about this, we're talking about dates that happen very early on in the investigation. They get an early indication from a Michael Young. Mike, coming back from Delta, stops by the side of the road, and he finds some written material, some checks and some check register that is that looks like it's made out that it's in the name of Paige Bergfeld. So he gets a hold of the sheriff's department and says, "Hey, I found this." When sent to the defendant to the driver's side seat of Paige Bergfeld's car, and cadaver sent inside the car, kind of in the back seat area. That's just to show that there's Bob Scott RV. They did some work around Bob Scott RV, and then it also shows you that where you can see on the bottom picture the scene, or what you can see from Bob Scott RVs over to Walker SMS. And this is the indication of the tracks that I just described to you, that they started in the area around the building at Walker SMS. They tracked over to this location, which is where the car had been found burned, and then they tracked down and along the 23 road and down to the front door of Bob Scott RV. They also took the canines down Highway 50, and the dogs tracked down Highway 50 in the area where the articles had been found, that Paige Bergfeld's articles had been found along the road, and they tracked down along the same track as where those articles had been found. They were working with both SIN articles from Paige Bergfeld as well as Lester Jones. And when they got down to Bridgeport Road, which is a road that goes off to the right if you're headed south, they tracked down to the river, and they did give some signs of cadaver scent down at the river, down at the Gunnison River. But when they came back out on Lester Jones's scent, but not on Paige Bergfeld's scent. And they weren't scented for cadaver coming back out, so when they got back out, they came north to Grand Junction. And you'll hear about that and what the results of those tracks are. You'll hear from witnesses who say that Mr. Jones in the burned car. One of the things that was located was a burned up. I told you there were several things that were found that were burned up. One of those things was a calendar. She used a calendar for her business, and one of the things that was found that had been burned but not completely was this calendar in Paige Bergfeld's car. And what's interesting is that there are key pages torn out of that calendar, the pages that would encompass the time around the area. Some of those are human bones, some of those are Paige Bergfeld's bones, some of those are animal bones. But that picture shows a little bit better, and I think there's a better picture yet of her skull partially protruding from the creek bed there, along with some bones there, and Danielle Gallegos will tell you that when she was hiking, it looked like maybe her knee. And determines that in fact the remains are from Paige Bergfeld. And then Dr. Diane Friend
Yes.
I'm positive I know the answer to this, but do you have a docket on Monday? I'm asking because are we going to have access to the courtroom before 9?
Oh, I'm pretty sure I do.
Yeah,
I'm almost totally full.
How could you not, given
I
our time?
do. Yeah, I start at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
I have 3 cases between 8 and 9.
Okay. We will make it work, just thinking ahead. We have a lot of stuff to carry over, but we'll make it work. It's really not.
Yeah,
hard.
okay.
I can get people to help us.
All right.
We'll get it all done.
Thanks.